Shalom and welcome to Jerusalem Studio. If one judges solely by input, the American campaign against the Iranian proxy Ansar-Allah's aggression out of Yemen is impressive, with more than 1,000 targets hit since mid-March. However, if the standard is the output, there is little evidence that the Houthi tribe and its local allies are about to stop harassing Israel as well as international maritime shipping in the Red Sea. With Israeli Air Force hitting back after the recent close call at Ben Gurion International Airport here in Tel Aviv, tensions are certainly rising, but threats arising from Iran rather than its semi-independent proxy are yet to materialize. What could be the next chapter in this unfolding story? Joining us all the way from the United States in Washington, D.C. is Brigadier General, or retired Brigadier General rather, Mark Kimmett, formerly an Assistant Secretary of State for Political and Military Affairs in the United States. It's good to see you, General.
Good to see you, Jonathan.
Also joining us from elsewhere here in Israel is Colonel in Reserve Oren Ben Shalom, who is a cross-cultural strategist and a senior fellow at the Institute for Counterterrorism at Reichman University. It's good to see you, Colonel. Last but not least is our TV7 editor-at-large, Mr. Amir Oren. Amir, consecutive strikes by Israel against multiple targets at a time when the United States is also pounding at this Iranian proxy are, quite frankly, just the beginning.
Let me remind you, Jonathan, and our distinguished panel, of a short piece of history. Israel went to war in 1967 because the Sharm el-Sheikh Straits, the Straits of Tiran, were blocked, and an international force was very slow in materializing. And having done so, the Egyptians managed to bypass the Tiran Straits by closing Bab el-Mandeb in the Yom Kippur War. And it was only opened as part of the disengagement of forces agreement that Henry Kissinger mediated between Golda Meir and Anwar Sadat. Now, the port of Eilat has been paralyzed and for all practical purposes closed for almost a year and a half now, because the Houthis joined the fight between Israel and Hamas on October the 17th or so of 2023. But it was only when Ben Gurion Airport or its immediate vicinity was hit by an errant missile, one penetrating the thick air defense by both, or air and missile defense by both the United States and Israel, that Israel hit back at the Sana'a airport. Hodeidah, the seaport, has been hit earlier by both CENTCOM, the Central Command, and the Israeli Air Force. But now it seems as if more devastating attacks are needed in order to both degrade and deter the Houthis.
General Kimmett, your take on the latest developments vis-a-vis the Yemeni portfolio?
No, I agree with Amir. I mean, the fact remains that I think Israel has been very judicious in their cautious approach to these types of attacks. It almost seems as if there is a reciprocal manner on the part of Israel that if you're going to attack a military base, we'll attack military infrastructure. If you attack a civilian base, we're going to go after your civilian infrastructure as well. I was asked on other stations, other channels, whether this signals an escalation to the point where it could draw the region in. I don't think so. It's an unfortunate event, but at the same time, this seems to be just business as usual.
Colonel Ben Shalom, your perspective to this matter?
Of course, there are various levels to look at this, even from the operational level, because Yemen is far. And for the Air Force to carry out an operation like this, it's not an easy task. Yet you see when it needs to be done, it's launched very swiftly. To relate to the issue of the kinds of targets, I would guess that the IDF carefully assesses this target to be a valid military target, explaining that these civilian or half-civilian infrastructure are heavily used to support the Houthi regime, also including by intelligence, seeing Iranian equipment coming through there, and they use these these ports. When we attacked ports, electricity and fuel, all of these have to be tied in to the logic of degrading the Houthi capabilities. The only thing I'll say at this point now is that we're not going to give them 2 blows and they'll give in. It's going to be long, probably for the duration of this war. This is only one front of many.
Indeed.
Let me ask a question, just throw it in the air.
Go ahead.
If Israel intends to respond in kind, why doesn't Israel launch missiles at the Houthis rather than send all of these armadas with fighter planes, refueling, search and rescue, and whatever? It's much easier and perhaps less expensive to launch another ballistic missile, if Israel has several of those. Who knows?
Well, Israel may and does, naturally, but nonetheless, when we're talking about rhetorical questions, why don't you answer that same question with that same exercise? Go ahead.
Well, obviously, if Israel does have such an arsenal, it would rather keep it for another contingency.
Exactly. Well, General Kimmett, when we're talking about the current aspect, though, we're seeing quite the robust American campaign by Central Command against various targets. We need to separate between the fact that the U.S. Central Command is focused specifically on freedom navigation of maritime shipping, something that the Houthis have been preventing or thwarting for quite some time now, since October 17th of 2023. But at the same time, Israel is dealing with the Houthi front as part of a broader scheme, namely that of the Islamic Republic of Iran, which continues to fuel various fronts against the state of Israel. How do the two separate portfolios converge in this aspect?
Well, the sad part about it is I think of late, since there is talk about resuming with a strong amount of push from the president, that actually could cause them to deconverge and decouple. It's clear that the Iranians have already persuaded the Americans to take the issues of missiles and proxies off the table and focus exclusively on the nuclear issue. And so it may be that the signal being sent by the U.S. is you get a free pass on the proxies so that we can get ourselves to a nuclear deal. Now, I don't think it will ever be that stark. I don't think it will ever be that much of a transaction, but I don't think that what's happening in the upcoming discussions will have any consequence on what's happening on the ground and in the air over Yemen.
Colonel Ben Shalom, as part of your givings, you were also a pilot, among others, and you know the Yemeni arena quite well. What is the main complexity for Israel beyond the fact that it's roughly 2,200 kilometers away?
Well, I don't want to sound like I'm bragging, but not too many complexities. And you see that even in distant arenas, for instance, Iran, where we did exchange a few blows, the other side can maybe jab us in the eye, but then we give them a serious punch, break their nose, or give them a body shot. So this has been repeated time and time again. Of course, it's spinned by the other side. They can say, we didn't hit anything, we didn't do anything, but you see that each and every time when we deliver such a blow, it's serious infrastructure, it's taking out capabilities. Your question about carrying out such an operation, not a big deal. You have the assets in the air, you have air-to-air refueling, a whole background of intelligence, support aircraft prepared for contingencies. It's a classic military operation, not too difficult. I will say, but for a small country like Israel, 2,000 kilometers away, not a simple thing to do. But in this day and age, and with the technology that we have, and with the support of our other allies, because we're not alone in the region and we're not operating alone, not such a big deal.
General Kimmett?
Yeah, I completely agree on the capabilities, but as we all know, the attack is only as good as the intelligence that is provided. Now, look, I think we understand that airplanes aren't moving that quickly. Airfields don't move. Oil tankers don't move. Oil tanks don't move. But when you're trying to do operations that somewhat resemble the 1991 scud hunting that we were doing in the Anbar province inside of Iraq, it's very, very difficult to have proximate timely intelligence, and that's where that 1,400 mile distance, or in our case, a little bit less from the aircraft carriers, makes a difference. Because even if you can see it, it doesn't mean you have persistent intelligence on the target, and it could very well be by the time you get your assets over the area, that's been either a fleeting target or an insignificant target. So going against main infrastructure, yes, you can get the body shots, you can get the face shots, but when you're talking about going against these small mobile missile launchers that have proved so expensive to focus on, it's a little more difficult without much more persistent intelligence that can stay on top of that target until the bomber or fighter gets there.
Colonel Shalom, in that same line, to what degree does Israel tap into intelligence agencies that are of partner militaries, of allied countries? And within that context, naturally, Israel has been contributing to the campaign in Yemen, but the capabilities from an Israeli perspective versus the American perspective are naturally somewhat spread out, since the main focus would, I assume, be on the Iranian component within the smuggling efforts to rearm the Houthis with dual-use components that ultimately the assemble lines we know are in Yemen, where they develop the various projectiles to be launched against both freedom of navigation in the Red Sea or against various commercial assets transiting there and the State of Israel.
Well, before October 7th, I would probably speak about Israel's incredible intelligence and the fact that we are able to penetrate our enemies and know everything. Some rivals like Iran, we clearly said, when I say we, I mean the prime minister, clearly said, we know everything. We know everything that you do. We know where it is. And this is a change from our strategy from past years. But also we have to be honest and say that not every arena is an arena that we focused on. I'm sure that we didn't invest most of our efforts in recent years specifically in Yemen. You can even see, everyone can analyze the difference between Hamas and Hezbollah, and you can see of course, October 7th itself, the surprise attack, and the outcome of the war and our ability to wage it. Certainly the Iranian component is something that we've been following very closely. We have extremely good knowledge, insights. But remember that every partner brings something to the table. I would argue that the Saudis probably have very good intelligence, and intelligence here is much more. It's the cultural understanding. It's deeper issues. The key to all of this is cooperation. It's collaboration. Probably all I should say in this medium is that partners work very closely together. We share a lot. I would say in some issues we share everything, understanding that the only way to succeed is to work hand in hand, shoulder to shoulder, and fully collaborate. Intelligence is a classic thing that we should and are doing.
It's a matter of tasking and priorities. And as Reuven said, you can't do everything. You can't be everywhere around the globe. And it takes time to develop linguistic expertise. It's not only the language itself, but the lingo, what the military officers and others are saying, to know exactly what this particular tribe is saying. The first few launches of Houthi missiles in October of 2023, Israel had almost zero intelligence on Yemen. Obviously, a year and a half passed. By now, Israel has more robust intelligence, both collection and assessment. But as Reuven said, you must collaborate with your partners. We know that there is this Five Eyes arrangement. Maybe Canada will be kicked out of it if it doesn't behave. But in any event, Israel, starting with an eye, is the sixth eye.
I doubt Canada will be kicked out of it. There's no interest in doing so. But nonetheless, General Kimmett, let's talk for a moment about the objective. What is a feasible objective to reach from a short-term perspective, a medium-term, and a long-term? And how long do you see something like this executed within the time span in front of us?
Well, I think it's quite simple. In the short term, it's contain. in the long term, it's defeat. In the interim, it's deter. And each of those have a different requirement. Each of those have different needs. But the first thing we've got to do is shut it down, whether it's by attacking the supply routes or whether it's responding to the missiles as they come in. That's got to be the first imperative. But containing it is not sufficient. You have to then go to the point where you deter it so it doesn't come back to bite you in the future. And then in the long term, what we'd like to do is just defeat the capability so it has, even if it had the willingness, it didn't have the capability.
There was a lot of talk within the various communities or defense communities about the possibility of employing the local tribal opposition to the Houthis, which still hold a large part of Yemen and have made some gains, particularly with the backing of the Emiratis prior to Biden's decision to halt support upon entering office in 2021. Do you see something like this move forward into a new stage where there will be a backing of a ground operation by local forces against this Iranian proxy?
Well, it stuns me and has stunned me for quite some time why we aren't doing that from the beginning. The fact remains is we can have the best intelligence in the skies, we can have the best assets in the skies, we can have the best equipment in the sky. But the only way you're going to be able to defeat the Houthis for the long run is by troops and boots on the ground. And why we haven't been working a partnership program to train, equip, advise these forces. I will be the first to admit that I don't know Yemen that well to know the specific tribes and if it's worth an effort or if the result would be even worse. But there's got to be a reason why we haven't embraced that approach from square one.
Before I move to Colonel Ben Shalom, I'd like to ask you also, since there is always a fear that Al-Qaeda in Yemen, which is one of the most vicious components of this terror group or global terror group, there is a concern about them rearing their ugly head and seizing control. Would that maybe be one of the calculations within that context, since the Houthis were actually American partners back in the day fighting Al-Qaeda?
No, that's exactly right. We were, the Houthis were with us until they were against us. They were the best ISIS fighters. But again, that's that second and third order consequence that I was referring to. If you defeat the Houthis, you end up with something worse. But I think that's a prescription for doing nothing.
Indeed. Well, Colonel Ben Shalom, if I look at the broader perspective, the real loser from this ongoing Iranian-backed campaign against maritime shipping is no other than Egypt. For Israel, despite the frustration of commercial shipping entering into the Red Sea and then ultimately reaching the port of Eilat is, of course, difficult for the city of Eilat, but nonetheless, maritime shipping and commercial goods transiting surrounding the Cape of Hope into the Strait of Gibraltar and from there all the way to the ports of Haifa and Ashkelon and Ashdod ultimately allow goods to enter Israel despite being somewhat more expensive, but it's also not as significant as people seem to think. Egypt, just 2 years, 3 years before the Houthi aggression against freedom of navigation, established yet another canal, the second Suez Canal, adjacent to the old one, which was a significant investment that Abdel Fattah al-Sisi proclaimed would bolster the flailing economy of Egypt into more prosperous horizon. Unfortunately, that's not the case. But I'd like to hear your take on that, and what are the complexities within that context?
That's very true. And this reminds me in a broader picture that for many years, Israel would talk about a local problem or a regional problem and try to tell the world, this isn't only our problem. This isn't only threatening Israel. Many times this was seen as, maybe Israeli propaganda or Israelis trying to throw out troubles to others. But here's a classic example where when they threatened maritime routes, this certainly was not only an Israeli problem. I would even argue that that is a bigger problem than an occasional rocket that may penetrate Israel's airspace. I called it like a jab in the eye. Okay, it means a lot when you shut down Ben Gurion Airport, but still, with all due respect, there are larger strategic issues. I would recommend to look at this and see that it's very interesting that there are players that are impacted dramatically, but they are not necessarily the ones that are very vocal about it. Probably the biggest example is China. China has interests throughout the region, economic interests all over, from the Horn of Africa and in Egypt itself. Their whole long-term strategy of building seaports and having this freedom of navigation, and of course, all to support Chinese interests, those interests must be seriously impacted now. Where are they? Is China condemning the Houthis? Is China saying or doing anything about it? Not much. This just comes to show us that many times you can be a player that is invested in something or you're impacted. You not necessarily want the rhetoric to bother you in other aspects. That's why I think China is pretty silent about this. Egypt cares a lot about it. Egypt is very much aligned with us and with the Americans. And I think you will see in the future also their actions here. The only other point I want to point out here is, as far as expectation management, I think this is going to continue throughout the war. The Houthis will continue to fire rockets. We're not going to stop their abilities. So our discussion now should be the long term, and that is bring down the regime of the Houthis in Yemen, not only for us, not only the world, even for the people of Yemen that are suffering under this brutal dictatorship.
General Kimmett, I know that naturally back in 2009 when Task Force 151 to combat Somali pirates, the Chinese entering the theater ultimately brought about the establishment of a very magnificent naval port of the Chinese Navy in Djibouti. If I remember correctly, the person in charge of the task force was no other than yourself?
Well, it was perhaps even worse than that. I was in charge of building the coalition for the counter-piracy campaign, and the first ones to show up at the first meeting were the Chinese. Look, I think why is China being silent about Yemen? Because they're playing the long ball. They are figuring out that the best way to approach the Yemen conflict is by helping out Egypt. Egypt, who is desperate at this point because of the consequences of this war, has now conducted the first military operations ever, joint military operations with China. So China is actually playing the pool game, which is not hitting the first ball, but focusing on the second ball, which is how does this situation in Yemen give us the opportunity to insinuate ourselves into, in this case, Egypt a bit more, and they've done a pretty good job at it.
A joint operation or exercise, I think it was.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, on that, I think it's important to know that the designation or the redesignation of Ansar-Allah, which is the umbrella organization led by the Houthi tribe alongside dozens of other tribes in that coalition, was actually stating quite equivocally that just before the American vessels, American flagged vessels, were targeted, a Chinese vessel was transiting the Strait of Bab el-Mandeb without any consequences. So it seems like the Houthis know very well which are the Western ships, which are the Russian ships that are not targeted, which are the Chinese ships that are not targeted, and naturally that also establishes a robust dependency by the Egyptians on both those Chinese and Russian vessels transiting those areas. And the one actually country that was impacted from a maritime perspective the most was Germany, which is also an interesting aspect.
Jonathan, you probably remember that a few years ago there was talk and even on paper a plan to transit from India through the Gulf to Israel.
IMEC.
And from Israel to points west, whether in Europe or wherever. Why don't
Cyprus, Italy.
Yes, why don't the Saudis have an east coast on the Arabian Gulf, Allah forbid that we call it the Persian Gulf, and a West Coast, not far from the Sinai, not far from Jordan, not far from Israel. If they build a railroad, the Chinese would probably do it very quickly, or a trucking route, or both, they could bypass Bab el-Mandeb. The offloading of the ships would be in a Saudi port. This will be transshipped through Sinai, so the Egyptians will get their revenue, and the Houthis will lose their choke point. Why not?
Well, why not? Because that's not the way Egyptians think.
Saudis should.
And the Saudis here have also an opportunity. There is right now talk about the Saudis in the process of buying land in the Sinai Peninsula, which wouldn't be the case unless the Egyptians are desperate for capital. So there are other aspects at play here that we also need to take into account.
The Saudis lack land.
The Saudis don't lack land, but the Saudis lack land in Africa. And that is something that will, of course, allow them beyond Tiran and Sanapir that was transferred to them just recently, last year or 2 years ago by now. They are buying Egyptian lands. And by the way, the Emiratis as well have just procured certain...
Well, it's not certain whether Sinai is in Asia or Africa, but I see your point.
Well, North Africa, in any event. This is all the time that we have for today. I'd like to thank General Kimmett and Colonel Ben Shalom for all of your insights. I'd like to thank also Mr. Oren and all of you at home as well. Until our next edition from here in Jerusalem. Shalom.
I'm Eran, former Deputy National Security Advisor here in Israel, a diplomat, a strategist by training. I'm very happy to be at TV7 and offer my interpretation along my esteemed colleagues. The strong point of TV7 is to be a reliable source of authoritative insight in an era of shallow news environment that is very difficult for viewers to trust.